Yes.
Your witness statement suggests that, well, let me ask it this way. Do you have any independent recollection of the process that was required, the process of applications for single grants? Or is your statement based on a consideration of the documents?
I'm afraid it's based on a consideration of the documents.
Can we look
at sorry, just I would say that what I do remember, once Susan Daniels was the caseworker, that then the process was that she would be in very regular contact. She would know their needs, and she would tell us, and there would be discussion. But if there was any paperwork, I would imagine that she would help them, and she ran that bit, and we trusted and knew that she was running it very well. So at that stage, I did know the process.
So if I can ask you some questions then on anything that you can recall about the process prior to Susan Daniels. If we can turn up MACF 40176_002, which is the Eileen Handbook from 1999.
Can I ask you something about the handbook?
Yes, here it is.
It's only that it's called the Eileen Trust Handbook, but I wonder if this is the latest, the final version, because, and I only noticed this last night, I'm afraid, it's got quotes in it. It says it's for people suffering from haemophilia. It talks about the trust being there since 1990, so, and various other things. I don't know if that matters, but I don't know whether everything in it is how we behaved in the Eileen Trust, or whether it was clearly based on the McFarlane Trust, and whether it's not the final version. I don't know if that matters, but that's just what worried me about it.
Well, that was the focus of some of my questions. Do you have any recollection of the circumstances in which this handbook was produced?
Well, I know we talked about a bit earlier, I think in 96, we talked about a handbook and decided not to do it, but to carry on doing ad hoc. Unfortunately, the two meetings, there's one meeting in June 99 where we're told, the trustees are told it's being done, and then the next meeting we're told it's been done. And both of those trustees meetings I wasn't at. But I sort of would be surprised that we wouldn't have been shown the final version, and I can't believe that we would have accepted this as the final version, not least, I mean, I wouldn't have, because I'm not in it, and the staff aren't filled in, and we would have spotted the differences. So yes. That's not very helpful.
So when you say you're not in it, if we turn to...
about the trustees, and yes. It just lists...
If we turn to page 14, I think it's going to be.
And the list of staff isn't full. It just has somebody's name, somebody's initial.
So it's just listed 3 trustees there. You're not there, and the staff aren't there. So
and the staff, the second one, A, is finance officer. I mean, surely that wouldn't have been in the final version. But I don't have a final version.
So this is the only version that the inquiry has. Do you understand that a version of the Eileen Handbook, whether it was this one or a final one, was provided to registrants and to dependents?
Yes, absolutely, and was sent out from 1999 with an accompanying letter from the secretary.
And if we look at the page 9 of the document, we can see their types of single payment. Do you recall this being a document that the trustees referred to when applications for grants for single payments came in?
No, but they're the subjects that we would have considered as being appropriate to give grants to.
So,
for.
and do you have any recollection of using this handbook yourself as a reference point for whether the procedure had been done correctly for applications or applications came within guidelines and so on?
No, I don't. It was all by discussion.
So do you think that the trustees in fact didn't use this as a guide?
Well, this they may not have done because it may not have been this edition. So we're rather handicapped by not having the whatever it was that was the eventual edition for the Eileen Trust.
Perhaps
these are the sorts of subjects that we would have considered. So we would have used, without seeing it, we would have gone through this sort of question: do they fit into these kinds of criteria?
And do you recall using a handbook of any kind for when assessing applications?
No, I don't think we did. I think I recall not using one.
So a handbook was sent out, whether it was in this form or slightly different, was sent out to registrants and dependents. But you don't think the trustees actually used that themselves?
I don't think when we were sitting around the table, we ever had a handbook that we said, does this fit the criteria? Because I think we all took it that we knew what the criteria were, which were the same as the ones in the handbook. So I don't think we were operating a different system to the one that we were talking to our registrants about.
And do you recall whether or not there were any particular requirements for applications for single grants in terms of evidential matters, having to provide quotes, having to do the application in writing or on a particular form or anything of that nature?
I don't think they had to be in writing, particularly if it was for a small, straightforward amount or something that the office could do. I think if it was anything significant, and I think we did ask for quotes. I don't exactly remember, but I would have thought we would probably have asked for a couple of quotes if it was easy and not too difficult for the registrants to do. We didn't want to make it difficult for them to apply for grants, and certainly in the early days, we had to encourage people to feel that they could. I think.
Why was that?
I don't know. Whether it was because they didn't like the feeling of having to ask, or whether it was because they were new to the trust, or maybe they didn't have the relationship with the trust in the. I mean, I'm talking about the first 2 or 3 years, but it's noticeable, even though they would be rung up and written to regularly, and they would be asked if they wanted visits, and they would be contacted by the staff. It wasn't until really till Peter arrived in 2001 when we started being, I think, more proactive. I think we were quite reactive. We said, ask if you want something. But I think once, as time went on, we started sort of pushing people more. And so if you look at the number of single grants that we awarded, in the 1900s, or the 1990s, they're below 30, and then from 2000 they go up, 45, 41, and then from 2002, when we were really every trust meeting going through every registrant situation, the grants go up to 60, single grants go up to 69, 68. So I think that suggests that policy of the trust being more proactive and saying, there must be things you want, and sometimes we would make suggestions, or we wouldn't, the caseworker would make suggestions because she knew what they needed. So it's a rather long-winded answer.
Your statement suggests that 60% of the applications were dealt with by staff. Would that have been the social workers and then latterly Susan Daniels?
Yes, I think there were more than one. I think there were more than one member of staff who were able to do it. I think the secretary certainly was, and the benefits advisor I think may have been also able. And I think that sometimes 2 people had to sign.
Susan Daniels, in her evidence to the inquiry, thought that the limit of her authority was about £250, so she could approve things that are up to a value of about £250. Does that sound right to you? Is that what you recall?
Well, I think in the office, I think it may have been higher than that. I think I've seen somewhere in the papers something which said if there was 2 of them, it could go up to 1,000, but that may have been later. I couldn't be certain about that.
And was there a process by which the trustees monitored, by which the staff reported back to the trustees the grants that they had allowed for monitoring purposes?
Yes, they were in the trustees' meeting when we went through each case. It would be itemised there.
And you would be looking at grants that had been given by staff in those.
I think so.
In those meetings.
I think so. I couldn't be sure about that now that you mentioned it, but I think we were.
So just returning then to the handbook, do you think that there was only one version of the handbook sent to registrants? Only in /99.
There's no record of one after that, and I think possibly because from 2001/2, we were getting reports of every registrant at every meeting. I think perhaps we felt that was the best way of getting the if people had a need, they didn't need to look at the handbook because they would be talking to the caseworker. And certainly once Susan was on board, that was absolutely the case.
So your understanding is that from 2002 there was very regular contact with all of the registrants?
I think there was regular contact always. I think it became more proactive in 2001, 2002 because the trustees were looking at it every trustees meeting and in a position sometimes to say, well, this person looks as though there's a need for X. Should we be offering it to them or asking them if they concur with that?
So it was the regular one-to-one contact, was it, that allowed the registrants to understand what it was they could apply for?
I would think that was the case. I don't think it was always face-to-face, but it was certainly the regular contact.
And were there any other guidelines or documents that you're aware of that were provided to registrants to set out what the trust did in terms of what was available to them in terms of grants and so on?
When they first started being registrants, they were sent a letter which outlined, broadly speaking, the principles of the trust. I think it said there were no guarantees of what it was there for, but basically we were there to give financial help and other help, but financial help to needs that they might have that were related to extra costs they were incurring because of being infected with HIV.
So there was that initial letter, and then in 99, a handbook of some sort. Was there anything else?
Oh, there were newsletters. No, there was newsletters.
Were you involved in the drafting of the newsletters?
I was involved in making them accessible. The early ones, well, certainly the first one that I saw was quite dense. If people are ill, you don't want to give them too much information, or if they're stressed, or it wasn't very accessible.
And information about what the trust was there to do and what people could apply for was contained within those newsletters, was it?
I don't know the answer to that, but I can't think what else would have been there. There was a reduced version of the annual report was sent out one year, I think. But I can't remember what else was in them.
And were you aware of were you aware of any dissatisfaction from registrants as to a lack of information? Is that information that ever came to the board? People didn't know what to apply for. They weren't applying for things because they didn't know that it was available.
No, I mean, I think because there were so few of them, then that was less likely to be the case. But actually, I think even if there had been more, I think partly because there was it was us and them it was quite a direct channel of communication. So I think perhaps they just did know more. I think maybe they were more aware.
And what do you think the advantages were for the trust in assessing all applications on a case-by-case basis, so without reference to criteria or guidelines?
Because I think that if you do it the way that we did it, and you do that carefully and thoroughly, it's not as tidy as having guidelines, but I think it's much fairer because guidelines tend to, in my experience, very often just sink to kind of the lowest common denominator of acceptability. And actually what we did, I mean, we had the guideline of financial need, which was the one that we were obliged to have being a charity, but in every other respect, I think it was more useful and more fair to assess them individually. And it wasn't necessarily the easiest way of doing it because you're not always comparing like with like, but the answer is not to really compare. I mean, I don't ever remember us saying we can't give X a washing machine because Y needs a respite break. We spent what we had to that we were able to.
And do you think one of the risks of that kind of decision making is that the very subjectivity it creates a risk of its own unfairness or inconsistency?
Yes, I do, and I think that's a very real risk. I think also if you've got a trust where you've got one very strong personality, their views might come through. But I think we were quite fortunate in that we were small, so there was proper exchange of views. Nobody was, in a big trust, very often you can sit on the sideline just think, I'm going to let it go. We were small and we were equal in our forcefulness.
And what is there anything else you can tell us about what the trust did to guard against that risk of unfairness and inconsistency as a result of subjective decision making?
I think we were quite good at asking the questions, even the kind of hard question about whether it was right to do something, and I think we all did that at different times.
I'm going to ask you some questions about the funding of the trust. Do you recall the Eileen Trust's attitude towards trying to obtain further funding from the Department of Health in the early years, so in the years under the Reverend Tanner?
In the very early years, we had £500,000, and if we were concerned about anything, it was more trying, if possible, to just spend the interest, because I think, well, I know because it says in the minutes that Reverend Tanner wasn't sure that we would get any money after that. He thought that the first £500,000 might be it, but actually, as time went on, and obviously we did spend the capital, we applied for and got another £500,000. So in those days, the process was quite, well, it didn't have to happen very often. It changed when we got into 2002 or 3, and the department became, their attitude was different, and they started just giving us annual amounts of money, which were never completely guaranteed, although I think we probably always thought they would happen.
And what was there a reticence, do you recall, about asking the Department of Health for a further top up after the initial £500,000? Was there a feeling that actually the trust should manage on that ad infinitum?
No, not at all, because by by several years before we applied for the second $500,000, we knew that we couldn't manage on it, and then the same thing happened. And there's some, I mean, we applied for the money after the second $500,000 when we were only 1 year into spending the first bit of that money. So I don't think there was a reticence, no.
Can I ask you to look at the document AHOH 5017, which is a trust board meeting from February 94. I think we've already looked at it, in fact. Yeah, 17th of February 94. Can we turn to page 3 of this document under further trawl? So I want to ask you about the relationship, the nature of the relationship between Department of Health and the Eileen Trust. Further trawl, I think what's being discussed there is trying to find further, if there are further potential beneficiaries for the Eileen Trust, and talking about searching for people who had not yet made a claim or received a payment in the first paragraph. And then the Trust approve a draft letter and leaflet for distribution via the Department of Health. And there's a discussion about providing information to HIV coordinators from the National AIDS Manual. And I'll come in and ask you some questions about that in due course. But it's the last paragraph there. It was agreed that no further major action be taken until results, if any, of the proposed circulation could be assessed. Beyond that, further action would be considered, though it was agreed that it would be necessary to avoid action which could embarrass and thus antagonise the Department of Health. That perhaps suggests a concern or a reticence about doing something that might embarrass or antagonise the Department of Health. Is that, do you recall a feature of the relationship between the Eileen Trust and the Department of Health in those early years?
I think in the early years it probably was. It wasn't as much as it could have been, but I mean, there's no other way of interpreting that other than us being wary of upsetting them.
And do you recall anything ever being said to you or reported to you by trustees as to how the Department of Health might react if they were antagonised or embarrassed?
No, I don't remember anything. I would imagine it would be that they might not give us more funding, but this is very early days when actually we didn't think we were going to have more funding. So I can't really understand what we were worried about. Well, yeah.
And would you agree that having that kind of a concern, if the Trust was concerned about embarrassing or was concerned not to embarrass or antagonise the Department of Health, that could impugn their independence as a charity?
I think it absolutely could. What I think is lucky is that this was a concern probably in the early days. By the time we got to the stage where we were really having to argue and push and fight for money, Peter Stevens was in charge, and the concern was he wouldn't have worried about antagonising the Department of Health.
We heard, the inquiries heard evidence from Anne Hithersay that when she arrived at McFarlane Trust and the Eileen Trust, she got a sense that the trustees were not keen on spending money on disbursements, that they were more concerned to keep it in the bank earning interest than dispersing it. Is that an impression that you would share, or do you have any comment to make upon that vis-a-vis the Eileen Trust?
Yeah, I heard that evidence. I would absolutely say that's not the case in the Eileen Trust. I mean, apart from the fact that it's interesting, in the minutes the money comes before the registrants in the early days, but not later. I don't ever remember anybody saying we can't do that, we need to save the money. Or it was, I think it absolutely was not the case.
Moving on then to the Peter Stevens years, and your statement tells us that a funding bid was made in 2005 asking for an increased allocation from the Department of Health to allow the Eileen Trust to give to have £250,000 per annum for disbursements. Did you have any input into that funding bid?
Unlike what I say in my witness statement, I was at the meeting with Caroline Flint. I thought I was only at one DOH meeting, and because of the papers I got referred to another one, I assumed I must have been wrong, that I thought I was with a Caroline Flint meeting. So I remember being there and talking, but I don't think I was involved in putting the figures together, except that we would have discussed them, the trustees would have known what was going to be said in that pitch.
So you don't think that you had any input into the bid as it went into the Department of Health, but you were there at the meeting when that bid was discussed with Caroline Flint in July 2006?
Yes.
Should we have a look at that meeting? It's DHSC 306259_046. And we can see there the attendees are Minister of State, who's Caroline Flint, and then a number of civil servants, and Peter Stevens, and you representing the Eileen Trust. And then the minute sets out the background, and then the nub of the claim from the Trust is set out in a number of bullet points. And I won't go through them all, but the government has a moral obligation to provide these special payments to their registrants. It can't be right for funding to be subordinated to the requirements of problems associated with NHS budgets. There have been promises on several occasions to review provision regularly. The basis of the original settlement was that registrants were not expected to live, but in fact, because of modern treatments they have, and the unexpected longevity has changed the role of the trust. And then at the bottom, there's a specific reference to the Eileen Trust. Many registrants fear exposure of their HIV status, and for some, this is seen as a barrier to claiming their benefits from other sources. And then a reference to Eileen Trust as a very conscientious caseworker who assists registrants in seeking all the available benefits and other areas such as minimising debt. And that you're referring to Susan Daniels, are you?
Yes.
And then over the page, the current claim is the first comprehensive review of what the Trust is doing. And for the Eileen Trust, although there are presently very few registrants, there's significant potential for new registrants to be identified in the coming years. And then it said, the Trust's representatives presented an emotive case describing the impact of their infection on their lives and the needs for adequate funding to maintain their dignity and independence. And then it says at the bottom, Minister of State listened carefully and effectively said she'd write and let you know what the outcome of her decision was. First of all, is this, as far as you're aware, a Department of Health minute? Is this a minute you'd seen before?
I don't remember whether I've seen it before. There's another account of the meeting which you sent me, so maybe this one is the Department of Health one and the other one is ours, because the other one is slightly different.
And what can you recall about that meeting?
I think that it didn't seem very conclusive. This seems a pretty fair account of what happened, and then we went away to see what she would come back with.
And we can see the response that you ultimately get. It's HSOC 305411. It's addressed to Mr. Stevens, 28th of July 2006. Dear Mr. Stevens, I'm grateful for your taking the time to meet me, etc., etc. And then I've considered carefully all the points, and I'm satisfied an increase of £400,000, approximately 11%, will maintain an appropriate level of support. And for the Eileen Trust, that means £177,000 for the year, as against your £250,000 that you were asking for. Can you recall what the Eileen Trust response was to that?
I think both trusts were quite cross about the response, not least because she says she's giving us £400,000 across the two, which she says is 11%. But then she says that we'll have to pay administration costs out of that, whereas hitherto both the trusts have been receiving a Section 64 grant, which was across the board, the two was equivalent to 330,000. So actually she was only giving us 70,000, which if you work that out, that's not 11% increase, that's a 1.9% increase. So I think what we were cross about was, A, that she wasn't giving us the money, but also that she was dressing it up and kidding probably nobody but herself that she was giving us 11%. And that just seemed, it was a lie. And she must have been aware that it wasn't a truthful representation of what she was doing. So I think both trusts were quite frustrated.
And you attended a meeting shortly after receipt of this letter at the McFarlane Trust on the 21st of August 2006. Do you recall that meeting?
Yes, I remember being there. I don't remember. If I didn't have the report you'd sent me, I wouldn't remember what we'd said.
Should we turn that up? It's MACF 5020_102. You can see there the minute. It's 21st of August 2006, by invitation, Miss Sue Phipps. And then if we go down the page to 2233.06, the chairman welcomed Miss Sue Phipps, a trustee of the Eileen Trust, who was present for the item on the minister's response to the business case for increased funding. And then the trustee's determination to consider a response to the minister's letter that we've just looked at, and that was considered first. The formal letter was tabled. The chairman referred to a report on it, and if we go over the page, there followed a wide-ranging debate. There had been, as widely reported, unprecedented levels of cutback in available resources to the NHS. It would be relatively simple for the DOH to report that against this climate, an increase has been made against all expectations. All negotiations with the DH were political in content, and the Trust had no political constituency to offer as a bargaining counter. Do you recall discussions of that nature, that the trusts felt they had no political constituency?
No, I don't. And in hindsight, I'm not sure that that's right, but I don't remember what we said at the time.
And then if we go down, there's a number of points made about future negotiations. And if we go down to E, the letter clearly indicated an offer to talk further. The key was how this offer should be addressed. And at G, the business case, a view shared by all, had not been addressed in any meaningful way, and that any future meeting should be demanded with urgency, as this was a matter that reflected the needs of the registrants now. And H, in terms of the way forward, the matter of resignation should be reserved. There was a need to understand the political situation that now confronted the trust, use the meeting with officials to seek to develop the funding situation over a period, and that the trustees had a clear duty and responsibility in their duty of care to the beneficiary community. And then I think if we go over the page, this is the right page, yes, to the beneficiary community. If we go down to K, I think we understand where the reference to resignation comes from. The chairman reported on the comments that he'd received from 2 registrants and advised the board of their content. Specifically, chairman should write to all members of parliament, chairman should make a public statement in respect to the letter from the minister that the trustees should resign en bloc. And then the next paragraph starts that after debating the response to the Minister's letter dated 28th of July relating to the business case for increased funding, the invitation to attend a further meeting with officials should be accepted to re-express the key points in the business case and how they affected the community of care, that the letter from the Minister does not address the views of trustees, and that they are minded to resign, and that there is a will to discuss with officials what sum of money there is that accords with the business case, where that might be found and from where. And an amendment was put seeking to strike out any reference to resignation at this stage and to only accept the invitation to attend a further meeting and seek at least a 3-year continuation of funding at the level finally agreed, and that amendment accepted and carried, and then you withdraw from the board meeting. Do you remember the discussion about resigning?
I don't think I do.
And presumably it was it, well, if you don't recall it, I don't think I can ask you any questions about it. But do you recall discussions about the trust feeling or a discussion about whether or not the trust should make a big, or the trustees should make do something significant to mark their unhappiness about the funding decision?
Yes, I remember that sort of conversation, but I can't remember the detail of what was said.
Do you recall whether the Eileen Trust had any similar discussions about either resigning or making some sort of big gesture to the Department of Health as a marker?
I don't remember it, and there's nothing in the minutes that go on in our meetings at this time. But I'm sure we would have had discussions. I just can't remember what we would have said. I think it's unlikely that we would have supported resignation, but that's only me now saying what I think we'd have done.
And why is that?
Well, because I think, you throw your toys out of the pram, you're still in the pram, you haven't got any toys, and I don't know that it would have got somewhere. I think we should have done more with this letter, because we were holding a letter signed by a Minister of State with some facts that were not right, and that surely could have been used.
Can we then look at the letter that was put on the website following that meeting? It's HSOC 305409. So that is an email sent from Martin Harvey. And is that CC'd into you, do you think? I know you're not, the full email address isn't there.
I think I've got a copy of it, but only because you sent it to me. Hang on, where would it be CC'd into? Yes, I must be the one at the end.
The one at the end. And it says, I attach a copy of the statement for the MFT website that was prepared by me yesterday. It has approval of the chairman and will be emailed to the webmaster today. It's under my name. Do we understand from that then that you wouldn't have seen the text of that letter before it was put on the Macfarlane Trust website?
I don't think so.
And then if we go over the page, we can see the letter. And it's headed "The response of the Macfarlane and Eileen Trust Boards of Trustees to the Minister's letter dated the 28th of July." It talks about a meeting on the 21st of August by the boards of both trustees. After considerable debate, it was resolved that the response from the Minister was unacceptable and that it failed to address the business case in any way, and the offer increase of 11% in overall funding was disingenuous. Then it goes on to set out the various negotiating tactics that were considered, and sets out the comments from a number of registrants, which we've already looked at in the minutes of the meeting. And then at the bottom of that page, it says it was agreed that the chairman of the trust should accept the invitation, which is set out earlier, of a further meeting, and that the trust's tactics should not be revealed including the threat of mass resignation in that letter of acceptance. And then right at the bottom of the page, the trusts were equally aware that any political leverage is not available, and the main weapon is the moral argument in that it was the NHS that inflicted this tragedy on the registrant community, their families and dependents, and that it was, and over the page, remains the Trust's ambition to seek additional funding to try and alleviate the hardship that catastrophe has caused and continues to inflict in terms of damage and deprivation. Do you recall any discussions at the Eileen Trust about trying to about political leverage and perhaps lobbying government ministers and so on for increased funding?
No, I don't. I don't know. And I suppose that by relatively soon after this, when the Archer inquiry was announced, I think that's where we focused our attention and our efforts.
There are, Shemit, you can take that down. There are some references in the board trust minutes about discussions about strategy with the Department of Health, which I can take you to if it would be helpful. But it simply says that in the board minutes it says there were discussions about strategy with the Department of Health, but they were not minuted. This is in around August 2008. Can you recall what the content of those discussions about strategy with the Department of Health was, and what the Eileen Trust's strategy was with the Department of Health?
I can't recall what it was, and I wish I could, because I imagine if we're not minuting it, well, I don't know why we weren't minuting it. I don't think I've got anything that's terribly helpful to add to that.
And you can't assist us on as to why it wasn't minuted?
No.
What would the Eileen Trust like to have done for the community had it had more funds?
Make it so they didn't have to apply for single grants, except have the single grants as a safety net in extreme circumstances, but make it so that they had enough money to live decent lives, not just kind of get by on a week-by-week basis.
And prior to, is it right that the annual weekends for the Eileen Trust started in around 2006, 2007?
I think 2007 was the first. It was discussed back very early on, in 1995 and 6. We had some of the registrants wanted to meet, and it was explored, but it came to nothing in the end. But I think it's a shame that we didn't perhaps encourage it more at that stage, because if we'd just had a meeting with 4 or 5 people, one could have built on that. And as it was, we didn't have a meeting until 2007, and then most years after that there were events, and they were successful and useful and of huge value to everybody.
And prior to those weekends, what was did you as a trustee have any contact with the registrants?
Not en masse. There was one particular registrant, Gary Kelly, who was very. He would come up. I remember him being in the pub with the trustees having a drink at some occasion or other. He was very articulate. Well, from my point of view, he gave me history lessons of the politics and the history of everything that had gone on before. But apart from Gary, I didn't meet any of the other registrants until the first or the second registrants meeting.
And what benefit was there any benefit, do you think, from meeting registrants to you as a trustee when you were discharging your...
But I think you were probably saying, what benefits did I have as a trustee?
Yes,
from going to the meeting?
In meeting the registrants.
Oh, I think it's huge. Even though we have very, very good reports from Susan and from, in some cases, from her predecessors, I think, meeting the registrants in both ways, for them to meet you and us to meet them, it's, we are all on the same side. We are all in this together. I think it just gets rid of barriers. It makes, I think it's a huge benefit. And obviously, I think, for the registrants, it's probably an even more benefit for them to meet each other.
And given that you were making decisions about applications that they were making for things that they were saying they needed, did it help you to have a greater understanding of who they were and the circumstances in which they were living?
I suppose it put sort of colour into it, but I think we were so well informed by Susan that I don't. It brings it to life more, but I don't think it was. I think we already knew quite a lot. I think we already understood quite a lot.
So in the early years before Susan, do you think it would have been helpful if you had been meeting the registrants? Do you think that would have helped your decision making?
I think it would have been. I just think it would be good for the running of the trust. I think it. Whether it would have helped, yes, is the answer.
And did the Eileen Trust have any any formal links with any other charitable or campaigning organisations which represented the non-bleeding disorder HIV-infected community?
I don't think so.
And was that ever discussed, to your recollection?
Whether
you should have you should form such links with such organisations.
I don't remember that ever being discussed.
The last topic of questions I've got for you is on the Eileen Trust's actions taken to identify new registrants. Your statement makes it clear that it was for the Department of Health to identify potential registrants for the Eileen Trust, and is that right?
Yes. And then it was for us to approach them and try and get them to engage with us.
And we've seen from the annual reports we've just looked at that the Eileen Trust were concerned about the low numbers of registrants that are registered with the Eileen Trust. Is that right?
Yeah, yes. Well, sorry, are people from the applicants?
Yes. So the people that had capital payments from the Department of Health, not all of them, as I read the annual reports, had then come on and registered with the Eileen Trust. Was that the position?
That was the position.
And did you raise that concern with the Department of Health? Do you know?
No, because at that stage, if they'd had their applications to the Department of Health accepted, then we were writing to them. So it was more whether we were approaching them in the right way. And I think we wrote subsequent letters. But the trouble was, until they'd said we had their permission, we had to use the Department of Health to send the letters to them, or send letters to them. And we felt that actually it would be better if the letter could come from us. So at one stage, instead of saying, instead of having a letter from the Department of Health, we asked them if it could be an open letter that we'd written, because we thought that might get a better response. But there came a time when I think we assumed that if people weren't choosing to register with us, then that was their choice, and we had to respect it. But who knew why they weren't? Maybe it was just too difficult. Maybe they were too ill. Maybe they were too frightened of the stigma. It was such, in those early years, it was such a different world to how it was even 10 years later.
And did the Department of Health allow you to send that open letter?
Well, I think they did. There's a minute saying we'd sent it to them, and then much later there's talk about a letter having gone out, and I assume it's the same one.
Was there a concern that the Eileen Trust had that in fact the Department of Health weren't identifying all the potential beneficiaries?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I certainly, I mean, they did do things. They did get in touch with, in the early days, with solicitors and HIV coordinators, but as a campaign with the social work press and the medical press, so that it was absolutely front of mind as opposed to just putting it in the National AIDS Manual, which is fine, but isn't.
Ms. Phipps, I think we lost you a bit there. I'm afraid.
Would you like to repeat the question?
Yes. If I repeat the question, so I said, was there a concern that the Eileen Trust, did the Eileen Trust have a concern that in fact the Department of Health weren't identifying all the potential beneficiaries? And I'll read out where we got to with your answer. You said that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Certainly they did do things and get in touch in the early days with solicitors and HIV coordinators, and then we lost you.
Okay, so but they had, which we didn't have, the resources both in terms of skills and expertise and presumably cash to do a much more concerted, proactive communication campaign. They should have been in the social worker press and the press and the medical press and the nursing press, certainly every 2 or 3 years, because we know that people were there because registrants went on trickling through. So, while on the one hand that suggests that maybe people did know about it, I don't think there was that much done in a seriously concerted way. It didn't look like something that somebody was trying massively hard to do.
And just for those listening, I'll just take you to the annual report, which sets out the steps that in certainly 94, 95 that the Eileen Trust took to try and identify beneficiaries. It's DHSC 302779_002. And this is the annual report from 31st of March 1995. And if we turn to page 4 of that document, which is the trustees' report, it says there 57 people have qualified for a settlement payment under the scheme, and of those 24 had made contact with the trust. Although not every settlement payment results in eligibility for help from the Eileen Trust, it was nonetheless felt by the trustees that this gap was too large and that there could be many people who were eligible and who might need help but were unaware that help was available. It has therefore been one of the major concerns of the Trust to identify and enrol those who are eligible. And then the next 2 paragraphs set out what the Trust done. This action has rested mainly on 2 projects. First, it was arranged with the Department of Health that they would send out another circulation to potential beneficiaries who had not registered with the Trust with a further invitation to do so. So that's trying to close the gap, is it, between the 57 people who had got this capital payment and the 24 people who had registered with the Trust?
Yes.
And then, secondly, the Trust wrote to medical and social work staff at hospitals and to contacts in voluntary organisations connected with HIV, giving information about the Trust and inviting referrals. And that's going, is it, to the fact that actually people may not have even got as far as the DOH to get their capital payment.
Yes.
And then it said.
Sorry, I was just going to say, because if they'd only become aware of their HIV status later on, they wouldn't have picked up any campaign that was going on at the beginning.
And it says both of these methods achieved some but limited success, and the Trust has also arranged to appear in the directory of the National AIDS Manual and other publications of this type. Additionally, the staff take all opportunity to follow up any leads, however slight. And can I just then ask you some questions about that last sentence, the following up of any leads, however slight. See an example of this at AHOH 5019. So that's a minute of a board meeting, 6th of September 1994. Again, we see you present. And if we go down to the bottom of that first page, registration statistics, the Secretary reported that there had been no new registrations, but following a press report of a boy in the Newcastle area orphaned in circumstances which indicated eligibility to register, the staff had taken action via both the DOH and the Newcastle area HIV coordinator to try to establish contact with the boy's guardian. And then if you go over the page, during discussion, it was noted that this was a case where Department of Health contact had only been made via solicitors, and it was questioned whether, in such circumstances, the circulars inviting registration with the Trust had been passed on. The Secretary was asked to take up this point with the Department of Health, and it was noted that the recent distribution of the annual report to address lists contained from the NAM had not resulted in any response, and it was agreed that there was little further scope for broad advertising, and further registration will be more likely to rest on follow-up to any leads, as in the present Newcastle case. So is that the sort of action then that the Trust were taking? Reading a report in a newspaper which may suggest that somebody qualifies for eligibility, and then following it up?
I think so, yes.
And in your witness statement, you make reference to the Liverpool incident. Can you recall what that was?
Yes, that was when there were, I think, three cases. There were, some infected blood had been used long after it shouldn't have been possible, and there was a case of, I think it was 5 people being infected with HIV. And I don't know how I think it must have come out in, actually I don't know how we knew about it, but as a result of that I think we had 2 new registrants from that.
Do you think that the steps taken by the Eileen Trust to try and find new registrants, were sufficient, or do you think they could have done more?
I don't think we had the resources to do a lot more. If it had been a group of people that one could easily identify and you knew where they were, it would have been easier to get their attention. But our potential registrants for the Eileen Trust could have come from so many different circumstances that I think it required skills that we didn't have. Everybody thinks PR is easy, and it's simply not the case. Something like this would have been way beyond our capabilities.
So those are all the questions that I had. I don't know whether it would be convenient to take a lunch break now so that the call participants and their recognised legal representatives can submit any further questions that they would like me to ask Ms. Phipps.
Yes, well, that would be sensible. Let me just explain to Mrs. Phipps what happens. There are, as I told you earlier, quite a number of people beyond this room who are watching, many of whom have legal representatives who are invited to put forward questions which occur to them listening to the evidence or having read your statement. And if so, Counsel to the Inquiry will consider whether to ask you those questions in due course. Obviously, she has to know what the questions are. That takes time, and so they'll talk to her over lunch. So we'll ask you to come back at 20 to 1, to 2, I'm sorry, it is now 20 to 1, 20 to 2 and see what further questions there may be. The likelihood is, can't promise it as a certainty, but the likelihood is that you will finish your evidence shortly after that. Now, I don't know if you heard last time we had a break that what you must not do is discuss your evidence with anyone during the break, whoever they are. So if you have lunch with your husband, you can't talk about what you've been saying to us, but you can talk about anything else you like.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you back at 20 to 2.